Let's start off these reviews with a look at one of my favorite silent films of all time, The Cat and the Canary, from 1927. Based off a stage play of the same name, it follows the relatives of Cyrus West, a deceased millionaire. They gather to his mansion for the reading of his will. During the reading, it's revealed that his niece, played by Laura Plante, has inherited his massive fortune, leaving everyone else with nothing. But there's a catch. She can only inherit Cyrus's fortune if she's examined by a doctor and pronounced sound of mind. If not, then an undisclosed member of the family will inherit the riches. While waiting for the doctor, they're notified that a mad killer named the Cat has escaped from a nearby asylum and is loose in the house. Now, the family members must evade the killer and possibly solve another mystery along the way. This is the quintessential old dark house film. If you haven't seen this movie, you might feel like you have because everyone has copied it. It has cobwebs, secret passageways, and plenty of dark corridors. That's perhaps the strongest element of the film, the look. Even the opening credits are delightfully eerie. That hand reaching out to clear the dust and debris sets the mood perfectly. You just know you're in for a spooky time. The look can be 100% attributed to the film's director, Leni. He was one of the pioneers of the German Expressionist movement in Berlin, and had just gotten done making the Expressionist marvel Waxworks. Here, he brings the distinct shadows and camera angles of German Expressionism, but also integrates a personal touch to the whole film. Leni's staging of his actors is unlike anything American directors were doing at the time. Somehow, with just the placement of his cast, he's able to evoke an unsettling nature. Lots of people classify this as a horror comedy because there's lots of wacky moments, but I never thought of it that way. Yes, there are definitely comedic moments in this, but there are comedic moments in The Invisible Man, and I don't consider that a horror comedy. I think of this as a chiller with silly moments woven in. I use the word silly because the comedy is, well, it's no Charlie Chaplin. I think these moments help the viewer have fun and not take the film too seriously. And every time I watch this, I have a great time. But I will say, there is one part of the film I don't like, and that's the romance between the two leads. Because they're related. And yeah, they don't have the same last name, and they're clearly trying to insinuate they're distant relatives, but it's still weird. Luckily, it's kind of shoehorned in, and it isn't really a huge part of the film. I always forget about it, but on this latest rewatch, I remembered, oh yeah, that's a thing. This film is part of a subgenre of old dark house movies that were very popular in the 1920s and early 30s. Essentially, all the plots revolved around a group of people stuck in a creepy old house over the course of one night. Some of the more famous examples are One Exciting Night, The Bat, The Monster, and of course, The Old Dark House. But The Cat and the Canary has always been my favorite, not just because of the look, but because of how it balances everything. There's actually quite a bit going on both aesthetically and story-wise. What I mean is that when you watch the film, it's pretty straightforward, but if you try to explain it to someone, you'll find yourself realizing it sounds kinda convoluted. There's lots of characters, plot threads, secret passageways, a mad killer, and a sealed second will. Just from that list, this film sounds like a mess, but it's not. It goes by at a brisk pace and does a great job explaining everything succinctly. Oh, and since it's a silent film, most of this information comes across visually. Of course, there are inner titles you have to read, but there are instances where they give them a visual flair. This keeps the momentum of the story going because it never feels like you're pausing to read info. It's like the action is leaping off the screen. And for me, that's what makes these titles brilliant. One of the best parts of the film is what you don't see. Well, barely see, and that's the cat. Most of the time he's kept lurking in the shadows, or a hand will reach into the light. Leni does an impressive job making sure the cat's presence is always felt throughout the film. The little glimpses we get are enough to keep our interest, and the reveal at the end does not disappoint. I won't spoil it for anyone who hasn't seen it, but skip to this time code if you want to keep it a surprise. The makeup on the actor is pretty gruesome. I love the fangs that protrude out his jaw. It looks like he could tear someone to shreds at any moment. Part of what I think makes this so effective is the simple approach to the design. We can still tell there's a person under there, and that familiarity makes it creepier for the viewer. It also helps that Leni lights and shoots him in such an interesting manner. But like I said before, you don't need to see the cat for it to be menacing. Most of the time, we only see its hand. The makeup on the hand is good too, but what really sells it is the actor's performance. I can't say who, otherwise that would be a spoiler, but I love how his hand slinks across the screen. It's slow, deliberate, and feels like the cat relishes taking his time. You get a sense that he's already caught his prey, but he's just trying to milk the chase as much as he can. But that's not the only great performance in the film. The whole cast is pretty strong. Crighton, Hale, Forrest, Stanley, and Flora Finch are all especially memorable in their roles as the other relatives. Each of them brings a physicality that leaves a distinct imprint for the viewer. Another highlight is the maid, played by Martha Maddox. Maddox is most famous for this role, and you can see why. Her presence is enough to put anyone on edge. She's lit differently from the rest of the cast, and I think it's fantastic. But the performer I'd like to highlight is the lead, played by Laura Plante. Plante was a big star in the silent era, and this film showcases many of her best attributes. Whereas many silent actors felt the need to go big and be expressive constantly, Plante was more decisive on when to go big. For a lot of the film, she's pretty restrained. She isn't constantly making over-the-top facial expressions to convey her inner turmoil. She's able to do that with just her eyes. She uses them with great emphasis, which makes her stick out compared to her contemporaries. She gives us enough to know what's happening in her head, while also presenting herself in a more realistic fashion. It makes scenes where she goes big more effective. On top of that, it makes her a more interesting heroine. I know we constantly look down on female protagonists who do nothing but act scared, but here, since Plante isn't over the top, her fear resonates with us. I don't think anyone would be brave if they were stuck in a house with a mad killer they couldn't see. We'd be on the edge the whole time, and that's what she is here. You can tell she's doing her best to hold herself together, but she can only do so much. Not only was Plante a star in the silent era, but she was Universal Pictures' most popular actress through all the 1920s. Born November 4th, 1904, Plante's career started out of necessity rather than desire. When she was a child, her parents divorced, and her mom took her to San Diego for a new start. They were able to make a decent amount of money, but in her teens, Plante's cousin alerted her about an ad in the paper that was asking for teen actresses. Plante applied and got the part and was paid fairly well. Not too long later, her mother started losing her hearing, and it was clear Plante was going to have to start taking care of her. She decided to take a chance and pursue acting in movies to get the money she needed. Not only did she make enough money, but she became Universal Studios' #1 star throughout the 1920s. Unfortunately, it was sound that killed her career, but not in the way you'd think. She had a pretty good voice and her acting still held up with the new technology, but there was a huge influx of new stars being brought to Hollywood from Broadway. Plante was just quickly overshadowed. Throughout the 1930s to the 50s, she took on mostly supporting and bit parts, and fell into obscurity. However, her strength as an actress was not forgotten by the industry. Shortly before her death in 1996, she received a star on the Walk of Fame. It's nice to know that this impressive talent was immortalized while she was still alive. Like I said earlier, this film is based off a Broadway play. It premiered in 1922 and ran for 329 performances, and starred Henry Hull as the male lead. Henry Hull would go on to have a distinguished career in Hollywood, and is most known for Alfred Hitchcock's Lifeboat and for playing the title role in Werewolf of London. This film isn't the only adaptation of that play. It was remade in 1930 as the early sound horror, The Cat Creeps. There was both an English and Spanish version of the film, but both versions are unfortunately lost. However, a couple minutes of the English version are still around because they were featured in a comedy short called Boo from 1932. I read a long time ago that the soundtrack for the Spanish version survives, but I haven't been able to find that source since, so I don't know if that was just a rumor. I do know that the female lead for the Spanish version was Lupita Tovar, who was the female lead in the 1931 Spanish version of Dracula. The play was also adapted to film in 1939, retaining its original title, The Cat and the Canary. This version is more comedic and stars Bob Hope and Paulette Goddard. It's a decent film, but it lacks the eerie look of the original. But this 1939 version is equally as influential because it inspired Walt Disney to build his Haunted Mansion ride. That's right, if there was no Cat and the Canary, there would be no Haunted Mansion. So if you're looking for a fun/spooky horror film, or want to check out a forgotten star of the silent era, then I highly recommend The Cat and the Canary.